Yeah, I think we have a quorum. Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning in the States. Warm welcome to our panel discussion on the Kremlin's ties to European illiberal parties and their joint information and propaganda networks. My name is Daniel Hegedűs. I serve as Regional Director for Central Europe at the German Marshall Fund. And it's my pleasure to moderate our today's discussion that even though we will be covering different case studies, actually, it couldn't be more timely after the first round of the Romanian presidential elections. Focusing on the findings of two papers that were just recently published in the Horizon project AUTHLIB, where AUTHLIB, the abbreviation actually refers to neo-authoritarianisms in Europe and the liberal democratic response chaired by the Central European University. So focusing on the findings of two papers and based on the case studies of the Austrian Freedom Party and Hungary's incumbent Fidesz party, we will discuss the narratives originating from Russia and how they are recontextualized and used for legitimation purposes in the political discourse of European countries. And we will also discuss the mechanisms, narratives, and processes that drive the exchanges between the information and propaganda ecosystems of the Kremlin, Austrian politics, and the Hungarian regime. And with that context in mind, I am truly honored to introduce our distinguished speakers who will guide us through the discussion. Bálint Mikola, Research Fellow from the Central European University. Dorka Takácsi, Visiting Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Franziska Wagner, PhD candidate, also at the Central European University. And last but definitely not least, Anton Shekovtsov, visiting professor, also at the Central European University. Regarding the housekeeping rules, we will begin with the discussion of the case studies and the lessons learned for about 45-ish minutes. And following this, we will move into the Q&A session. I would like to encourage you, ladies and gentlemen, to submit your questions either via the Q&A function or the chat function of Zoom, and we will incorporate your questions into the discussion. And I also would like to remind you that the event is recorded and will be available online at the YouTube channel of AUTHLIB. And having said that, not to abuse the time, I would like to pass the floor to Franziska and Bálint to proceed with their presentations. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for inviting us and giving us this opportunity to share our research. I will share my slides, and I hope you can all see them. Fantastic. So Bálint and I, we will be presenting our research that has the title Russia and Central European Illiberal Actors, Mutual Legitimation Amid the Full-Scale Invasion of Ukraine. And this is also written with our co-author, Lilia Sablina, who unfortunately cannot be here today, but I'm sure in thought she has joined us. To start with, the theoretical hunt, or rather the observations we came from for this work, was that for a long time we could observe a close relationship between Russian and European illiberal far-right parties. So this has gone on for several decades. And for instance, if you think about the observers that have been sent to the illegal referendum in Crimea in 2014, 2015, and also international cooperation in events between Russian actors, but also European illiberal far-right parties, there has been a close relationship. And then the full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened in 2022 by Russia. And we sort of saw, at least for some of the European far-right parties, that they very much continued very openly as well in their far-right sympathies with Russia, and had very opposed positions towards sanctions, and also very openly. So what we were interested here is in to what degree this close relationship continued after the full-scale invasion, and especially to which extent it continued to legitimize between Russia and European illiberal far-right parties in a sort of reciprocal relationship. So to begin, our research questions that guided this work were that we were interested in how this illiberal narratives that originated from Russia were adapted in the context of Austria, specifically by the Freedom Party, but also in Hungary by Fidesz, to understand better on how, from Russian side, narratives were adapted. But at the same time, we were also interested in the opposite part. So we were interested in how Russia uses narratives coming from Austria, narratives coming from Hungary into its own national context. So the research we did, as I mentioned, we were interested in Russia, Hungary, and Austria. And specifically, what we will be talking about in the next probably additional 10 minutes or so is the first year after Russia's full-scale invasion, so February 2022 until February 2023. So that's just for contextualization. And the sources we were looking at are party newspaper, pro-state newspaper in the case of Russia, and also blog posts, for instance, from the Austrian Freedom Party. And just a slight note on the methods, just to have this contextualized, to know what we're actually talking about. We did both an automated computational approach, namely topic modeling, but also manual discourse analysis. And also, this I just would like to mention very shortly, just so when Balin then follows up with our key findings, that you can contextualize this, is that we are talking about 3 specific issues here. So the first issue is, we call it topoi, which basically refers to recurring argumentative patterns or strategies that are commonly employed in discourse. So these are what we eventually will talk about in terms of argumentation patterns. But as I mentioned, we are also very much interested in legitimation. So this refers specifically to discursive practices used by political actors such as the Austrian Freedom Party, for instance, to persuade the public of applicability or the necessity of a specific action or policy. And what those are exactly, we will come back later. And lastly, we are focusing here specific on illiberal rhetoric and illiberal parties, which is a form of communication argumentation that rejects the liberal principles. And here we are also interested specifically in parties or actors that are in favor of a partisan state, for instance, where you don't have this objectivity anymore. So I have added here an example for you to illustrate basically what we're talking about. This is a press release from Fidesz, which illustrates the topoi of responsibility. And just let me read it out shortly. Inflation is high across Europe due to the war, sanctions, and rising energy prices. The government has decided to maintain the gasoline price cap, the food price caps, the interest rate freeze, and the cuts in utility prices to reduce inflation and to protect the Hungarian people. The left did not vote for any of these, and they want to make the Hungarian people pay the price of the war with their irresponsible demands for sanctions. If it were up to the left, we would have already have war and war-driven inflation here. So the important aspect I want to point out here is whom Fidesz makes responsible for the current economic but also political situation in Hungary. And what you can see here and what we argue is very much a topoi of responsibility is that this press release argues that the left, the political opposition, is responsible for the difficulties that the Hungarian people are facing currently, whereas on the other side, the government and Fidesz as the government party is very much trying to protect those people. So before I send you over to Balint, I just would like to mention what we were looking at, especially because basically what we did is we were looking for mentions of Russia. So any party newspaper, blog posts, press releases in Austria by FPÖ, on Hungary by Fidesz that mentions wordings related to Russia, like Russian, Putin, etc. we included in our analysis. And on the other hand, from the Russian side, we were looking into Izvestia, a newspaper, and we were looking for content related to Austria for the Austrian part. So words like Austria, Austrian, or the same also in the Hungarian case. And this we used to basically investigate argumentative schemes and patterns of legitimation strategies. But let me now move you to Barland, who will now talk about our key findings and the analysis that we did. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Franziska. I'm wondering if you can all see the slides showing the findings now. Excellent. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present our findings. As a disclaimer, I would like to add that in the authorship of this paper, there was a natural distribution of tasks and language skills too. So if you consult the list of the authors, Franziska was also present as a German-speaking and Austria expert. I was responsible for the parts that referred to Fidesz and the Hungarian case study, and we had Lilia Sablina as a co-author who was doing most of the analysis on the Russian case. Therefore, please apologize me if I may be somewhat partial to the Hungarian findings in my presentation. But we are here to cover all three case studies, obviously. So starting with the Austrian Freedom Party, FPÖ. So we had this two-pronged approach that we first looked at the most frequently occurring topics in each of these communication forms through using STM models. And in the case of the FPÖ, these were terms related to domestic politics. So these were one group of the terms that were discussed in relation to Russia. Then energy policy was another topic that frequently occurred in relation to Russia. And thirdly, FPÖ's stance on neutrality on Austria's national interest in this situation was a third topic that was highly prevalent. But here we were only looking at frequencies of how often these terms appeared in different forms of communication. And as a second qualitative step, we tried to establish these argumentative frames, so-called topoi, that were used to interpret these topics. And we identified four such topoi in the case of FPÖ. The first one was dependency, which was used to emphasize developments in relation to the war in Ukraine were not caused by a single actor, but were the impact of multiple, especially in the interplay between the United States, China, Turkey, European Union, and various other international actors. So the point of this topoi was trying to emphasize that it was not only Russia that played a role in the conflict, but various other actors. Then there was the topoi of national interest, which tried to emphasize Austria's national interest and the interest of the population in this conflict, and specifically to argue that the Austrian government of the time was not representing these interests. Then another topoi used by FPÖ was rationality, which tried to position FPÖ as a logical and reasonable actor and argue that support for Russia was well justified in this situation. And lastly, there was the topoi of responsibility, which tried to shift the blame for the economic and socio-political consequences of the war to the government, and particularly to Alexander van der Bellen. So moving on to the Hungarian case, we see a somewhat different list of topics that were frequently discussed in party communications. So in Hungarian party media, as well as press releases, there was a lot of talk about the specific military operations using terms like Putin, military power, soldier. So that was one of the most prevalent topics discussed. Then another huge topic was that of economic sanctions, which related to utility prices, gas prices, inflation, and so on. And then there was a third topic which discussed developments in a geopolitical perspective, referencing other international actors. And similarly to the case of FPÖ, we see some overlapping topoi here. So also here we have the topic, the topoi of dependency, which again highlights the role of other international actors in the conflict. We also have the topoi of responsibility. In this case, as you might have heard in the quote that was read by Franziska, this was most often used to shift the blame on the consequences of the war to the Hungarian left-wing opposition. Then there was a topoi of rationality, which again was used to present war-related developments in a common sense, unquestionable manner, very often portraying Russia as unquestionably a much stronger military power and therefore one that didn't make sense to wage war against. And lastly, we also identified the topoi of expert opinion, in which pro-Russia stances were attributed to external experts, often think tank people, but also often directly to the spokespeople of the Russian government, including Dmitry Peskov and the Russian president himself, without any further commentary or triangulation of sources. And lastly, in the case of Russia, we looked at how Hungarian and Austrian illiberal actors were referred to in the party newspaper Izvestia. And here we see a somewhat different list of topics that were salient, particularly two that did not emerge before were the Hungarian-Ukrainian relations, which were discussed as a separate topic in Russian media, and also Hungary's stance against the EU sanctions was very prevalent in the Russian corpus. And in terms of the topoi, we again see some parallels. So I'm not going to read each of these again because they use very similar argumentative patterns as the ones we discussed in the two previous cases. However, there is one that differentiates the Russian case from the other two, which is the topoi of counteraction, which we use to refer to cases when Austria and Hungary were discussed as or specifically FPÖ and Fidesz were portrayed as parties that stand against the sanctions introduced by the EU, and this emphasized the specific actions that these governments took against the quotation mark destructive policies of the EU. So as you see, several of these topoi were overlapping between our cases. I will show you a summary table at the end that will demonstrate how much overlap we found among these different argumentative strategies. But first, I want to show you a bit more details about how these topics and topoi were distributed in the different kind of publications of our specific cases. So without going through each of these bars, what you see here is FPÖ communications on the left and Fidesz communications on the right, and how each of the topoi were present in press releases, blog posts, newspapers, and which topics they were used to describe. And I think one important lesson that we can learn from these is that there was a great variation in the extent to which these different communication sources were diverse in themselves. So, for instance, if you look at FPÖ blog posts, you can see that they only used this topoi of responsibility to discuss three different topics, but with the same argumentative strategy. And you see the same thing with Fidesz press releases, which, by the way, were extremely repetitive. So Fidesz, they released 125 press releases over the duration of this year that we were looking at, and there was very little variation in their content, and they all used this topoi of responsibility, in which they mostly blamed the Hungarian left-wing opposition for all the ills of the country, particularly the high inflation and utility prices. Magyar Nemzet, which is the unofficial party newspaper of Fidesz, was a bit more variegated in its approach, and it discussed economic sanctions, geopolitics, and military operations a bit more even-handedly, and using all of the topoi that we identified. So this seems to suggest that different kinds of outlets and communication forms are controlled by these parties to a different extent, and unsurprisingly, press releases are under the direct control of the communication directorates of these parties. We also ran this analysis on how Izvestia, the Russian state newspaper, covered Hungary and Austria, respectively. And here, one finding I would like to draw your attention to is that expert opinion was used to discuss specific topics almost exclusively. So in the world section of the newspaper, you see that it was mostly used to discuss Hungarian-Ukrainian relations. In relation to Austria, it was used to discuss imports to Europe. In the economy section, it was used to discuss sanctions and Russian gas. So these experts kind of had a single profile, or they were used to underline a single topic in each of these communications. And now moving on to the synthesis of our findings. So as you see, we identified altogether 6 different topoi across our cases, some of which were very case-specific, but several of which overlapped between our cases. So we found this topoi of dependency, rationality, and responsibility in all our cases, and then expert opinion, counteraction, and national interest were used in an asymmetrical fashion. But to sum up our findings, we found that these legitimization strategies were employed by illiberal actors reciprocally. So they used each other as sources of legitimation in their communication across various communication platforms and outlets. And this interplay underscores the complexity of international politics and far-right movements. What could be considered a somewhat surprising finding is that Russia remained very relevant as a source of illiberal ideology and as a source of legitimation for European far-right actors, despite the backdrop of war and exclusion. And the instrumentalization of Russia persisted among Austrian and Hungarian far-right groups, even after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In government and opposition, this is one finding that distinguishes among our results. So Fidesz and FPÖ were not in the same position during our period of inquiry. Fidesz was a governing party and the FPÖ was in opposition. And this also made a difference in how they use these legitimization strategies. So Hungary or Fidesz primarily used it to deflect blame to the opposition parties, while FPÖ used its populist rhetoric for legitimizing itself and presenting the party as the sole and most authentic representative of the national interest of the Austrian people. And finally, we also wanted to formulate some policy recommendations based on these findings. Even though this is not our primary profile, but we thought this may still be helpful. So we thought that that our findings highlight that there's a lot of networking going on between illiberal actors at the international level, and somehow imposing a greater level of transparency on these networks of agents and cooperation between Russia and far-right parties and movements would definitely help enhance European security. Then we also think that it would be important for the EU to be a more capable actor that can sanction countries such as Hungary and Austria if they act against EU principles. Regarding the communication aspect of it, we think that a more systematic monitoring of overlaps between Russian and European domestic media would be needed so that we don't recognize these parallels in hindsight, but there's some real-time monitoring system established for that. And finally, there should be more emphasis on the training of journalists and providing practical examples and information that allow the press to recognize legitimation patterns and propaganda techniques, so as to avoid situations in which Magyar Nemzet, which is one of the still most important newspapers of Hungary, basically reproduces the interpretation of Dmitry Peskov about the war in Ukraine without triangulating it with any other source. This is purely really bad journalistic practice that maybe you could prevent with some training into professional ethics. So that would be the presentation of our findings. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and we are looking forward to your comments, observations, and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis Badin, for this intriguing findings. And I am mindful of the time, but please allow me just one comment and one immediate follow-up question. My comment would be, and I just would like to emphasize actually your contribution to the existing, to my perspective, primarily policy literature, or what I found particularly interesting, that there's a widespread perception that there was actually a chilling period between European radical right parties and the Kremlin, and actually how they engaged with pro-Russian narratives after the full-scale invasion, and that actually the reintroduction and the rehabilitation of the pro-Russian discourses happened after a period of 9 to 12 months, late 2022, early 2023, or reintroduction again into the European politics. And against that perspective, I think your paper is particularly interesting from the perspective that you are emphasizing actually the continuity of the discourse. And not only in the case of Hungary, but also in the case of the Austrian Freedom Party as one representative of the classical Western radical right. And it, I think, just a reminder for us that we should potentially also rethink actually this relationship in this particular period between the European illiberal forces and the Kremlin. And just my follow-up question, that it was particularly interesting to see that especially the Hungarian government propaganda, where actually the topoi of national interest has a very crucial role. In this case, it was an empty category. And my question is, what can be the reason for that? Why has the Hungarian government in this communication preferred the other topois and not the topoi of the national interest?
Thank you very much for questions. Would you like us to answer right away or at a later point?
I think if you can, feel free to address it, and then we will move on. Thank you.
Yes, I'm very glad to address maybe the first part, since Valentis knows more about the Hungarian case. I think for us, it was one important element to highlight was also to know that there is variation between illiberal far-right European parties. And I think this variation has become very evident after the full-scale invasion, because you have some party that openly supported sanctions and openly called it a war of aggression and stood against that. Then you have some parties that slightly, like Rassemblement National in France, for instance, there was a slight neutrality, slight opposing, but not very strict. And then you have parties who were very clearly silent on this issue. And silence for political actors talks a lot and talks very loudly, I think. And here for the FPÖ, but we also see it in other cases in Germany, but I think also in Hungary, is that there was a lot of silence initially, and then you had a move towards condemning sanctions. And for instance, in the Austrian case, this condemnation of sanctions already happened after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. There, Austria and FPÖ were a very loud actor against the sanctions that would only harm the Austrian interest. And I think this is just the continuation of what already happened before that we need to take into account. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Also, thank you very much for your comments, Dania. On the first part of your question, why we did not observe this chilling effect in the Hungarian case, there was such a chilling effect in the very beginning of the conflict. For about the first month, there was some insecurity in Fidesz about how they should communicate, and the reason I think it didn't last longer than that is that there was also a domestic crisis that they had to address, and an election campaign, and the timing of the co-occurrence of these things just came in very handy, because there were some very unfortunate statements in the joint campaign of the opposition, which could be used against them to argue that the Hungarian opposition was in favor of the war, and at the same time there was an economic crisis and record high inflation throughout this period, for which the Hungarian government had to find some scapegoat, and it was very easy to shift this blame to the Hungarian opposition and the EU, and connect it to the sanctions against Russia. Regarding why national interest was not more prevalent in Fidesz's discourse, I think there's one aspect that got lost in our terminology of the topoi, which I would like to highlight here, which is pragmatism. And I think that's key to understanding how Fidesz communicates about Russia. So every communication on Russia is cast in very neutral economic, geopolitical, energy policy terms, and very few emotional references are made, which I think are due to historical reasons that openly pro-Russian discourse is very unpopular in Hungary, and something that only the very extreme right parties flirt with. So you may have heard people chanting pro-Russian rhymes at our homeland party events, but they were even not very popular there. So so I think arguing that siding with Russia is in the national interest of the Hungarian people just doesn't really resonate with public opinion, and Fidesz is very cautious about that. So they try to portray it as an economic matter primarily.
Thank you both. Dorka, your paper has been actually a deep dive in the cooperation between the Russian and the Hungarian propaganda ecosystem. So I would like to give you the floor to present your findings and deepen on conversation on that matter. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm sharing my screen. Almost there. This clearly is the most stressful part. All right. So as I was informed that I was warned to be not methodologically heavy, but conclusions heavy. So is my presentation. So just a couple of words about my methodology. I was focusing on the cross-border propaganda networks between the Russian propaganda apparatus and the Hungarian one. And for that, I used a mixed methods approach. I conducted a thematic analysis, looking for recurring themes, looking for recurring narratives and key messages indeed. For that, I used primary sources, online outlets, both in Russian and in Hungarian, plus also to look at the broader picture, scholarly articles, think tank reports, and so on. So eventually that was the corpus of my research. What I was looking at was the intricate relationship between the two propaganda machines, and I wanted to demonstrate how they mutually reinforce each other's narrative and legitimize their illiberal practices. So a couple of words about the infrastructure, because eventually there are certain shared similarities between the regimes, but obviously there are major differences as well. What we can see on both sides, that we can see autocratizing tendencies, obviously to a very different extent, at least up until now. In the paper, I basically have brought in a lot of literature because there are numerous definitions about what is happening in Hungary and how can the Hungarian regime be best described. But here, for instance, I have taken the informational autocracy as best, given the fact that I'm focusing predominantly on the cautious and conscious use of information. And given the fact that the Hungarian government and the governmental propaganda apparatus can basically have such a hold on the information space in Hungary, they still can allow themselves to refrain from the use of, for instance, the other apparatuses. What we can see in Russia, however, is somewhat different because obviously we know that that is a consolidated autocracy. Also, the internet is heavily censored, not only the traditional media outlets. We also know that Russia, since almost a decade now, is longing for establishing the RUNET, which would be a sovereign internet. We know that the project itself cannot be called a success yet, but the intentions are surely there. What we also know is that numerous hundreds of pages are banned and blocked, also social media platforms, and that the information space is not only heavily controlled and censored, but there is also very intense propaganda, and we can see that the propaganda is carefully orchestrated. We can, for instance, look at the works of Viktor Orbán. In Hungary, however, we can see that the intention is also there to take over the media, at least since 2002, because we know that when the first Fidesz government has lost power in 2002, shortly after that, it's basically very well documented with numerous citations that the conviction within the party was that the elections were lost because of media, because of unfriendly media environment, which did not allow Fidesz to communicate what it did excellently well enough. And what we have seen was that after the constitutional majority takeover in 2010, we have seen that Fidesz has gradually taken really over the media. So what we can see now is that there is a large conglomerate, government-friendly media conglomerate with almost 500 outlets, plus the public broadcaster is also under governmental influence, and also the National News Agency. So what we can see is that the intentions are somewhat similar, even though on the infrastructure side there are differences between the two regimes. However, there are numerous shared tactics. If you look at this lovely picture, we can see that Vladimir Putin, when he visits certain places, we can oftentimes find the same people amassed as average people. It's basically very important how you portray yourself, and apparently, if you are a proper autocratic leader, you may not allow yourself to be represented among whatever people. You carefully pay attention to get the best people around you. But this practice, meaning the use of fake personas, if necessary, is not alien to the Hungarian governmental public broadcaster either, because probably the Hungarian audience remembers that there was, at the peak of the refugee crisis in 2016, for instance, there was one famous story when an allegedly Swedish refugee who already found the situation in Sweden absolutely unbearable, came to seek shelter and a safe haven in Hungary, where there are no migrants. Later on, it came out that this lady is actually was Hungarian-born, and the whole story did not end up. But this is just to showcase that the use of fake personas is not an alien practice from the Hungarian media practice either. Another thing is that if you are a proper autocratic leader and you want to create the illusion that your narrative, and you want to make your narrative convincing and more convincing than it actually is, you have to pay attention to giving the floor to the proper talking heads. In Russia, for instance, how it happens is that there is an organization called Integratia. And there was a gentle presidential administration's request to the operating media outlets in Russia that they should seek for expert opinion on every single topic they cover from the experts affiliated with Integratia, which obviously gives an extra credibility, probably because there are these extra talking heads. Obviously, in Hungary as well, there are think tanks which are closely affiliated with the government, and we know very well that the propaganda apparatus refrains to voicing exclusively them. So you can basically never hear in the Hungarian governmental propaganda the experts of independent think tanks or government critical think tanks. There are certain other shared tactics as well, because obviously if you want to maintain the illusion that the public is with you, which needless to say is something that autocratic and autocratizing regimes are striving for, it's very important to showcase exclusively organizations which can be displayed as organizations which agree with you. So for instance, proxy organizations, establishing proxy organizations is a shared tactic both by the Hungarian and the Russian regimes. What am I thinking here is, for instance, that earlier on there was the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers of Russia, which, as its name tells, was basically an assembly of mothers representing the interests of soldiers on the front. But unfortunately, for the regime stance, they became way too critical with regards to what is happening in Ukraine. So they started to voice criticism. The Kremlin did not let this happen, so they have established something which sounds eerily similar to the audiences of propaganda. So they have created another very similar organization, the Council of Mothers and Wives. And this newly established organization, even though in the media they portray themselves and they are portrayed as representatives of soldier mothers, obviously each and every request they have towards the president is way less critical, eventually not critical at all. So this is a very friendly organization to the Kremlin. In Hungary, we know very well that there are certain watchdog organizations, for instance, which put to their flag and carried as their main message the situation of fundamental rights in Hungary. What was the response of the government? They have created Alapjogokért Központ, for instance, which is a gongo focusing on fundamental rights, but obviously using the narratives the government pleases. There are certain other uses of these proxy organizations, especially in the media, but not only. So these proxy organizations, for instance, in Russia, the Dialogue Regions and the Internet Development Agency, can also be used not only to shape the public opinion, but also to circumvent campaign financing and campaign financing regulations. In Hungary, we can see that Megaphone and TÖV are doing something really similar, helping out, lending a helping hand to the government, shall there be need for that. Something else, which is also strangely similar in the two places, that shortly before the elections, state-supported, meaning taxpayers' money-supported cinematography becomes prevalent. So we can see that really large sums were allocated to such purposes also in Russia, building on stories, for instance, picturing soldiers from earlier ages in beautiful light, obviously carrying the message that whoever is a good Russian, whoever is patriotic and not a traitor, a slave of the West, should support the current moves and the current narratives of the Kremlin. In Hungary, it's enough to think back that before the 2022 elections, when the key enemy figure, or one of the key enemy figures which were used by the government to campaign with or to campaign against was Ferenc Gyurcsány, former Prime Minister of Hungary. And for that end, state-supported cinematography came to play a large role. And the Elkurtuk movie was not only shown and showcased in the movies, but also there was a widespread and very well-financed PR campaign carried out by the propaganda machine using the same slogan, using the same, basically the same adjectives to describe the movie, which was somewhat hilarious. Something else which is also pretty similar is that obviously everyone was very afraid of COVID. Therefore, the regimes also got hold on large databases, and these COVID-19 related information infrastructures were misused. In Russia, for instance, the Stop Coronavirus virus.rf was used, for instance, for the annulation campaign, which aimed at and which made Russian people enthusiastic and go to vote so that Vladimir Putin could go and run for president one more time, or basically any time, because he's already served terms were annulated. Well, so for this campaign, for instance, the Stop Coronavirus.rf was used. Something similar happened in Hungary as well, interestingly enough. There were two pages. The first was coronavirus.gov.hu, which was after that filled with propaganda messages praising the government's deeds. And the other one, vaccinainfo.gov.hu, also started to send out unauthorized propaganda emails before the elections to let people know who they should vote for. Another shared tactics, or there are still some more. Obviously, these regimes intend to preserve power using propaganda. What the Russian regime is doing in order to showcase that there is, for instance, an unanimous, unquestioned support towards its war against Ukraine, even though it cannot be called so, but everyone knows what we are talking about. For instance, for that, there is a show allocated, which is called Своих не бросаем. We do not let our guys fall, eventually. And for instance, this program is showcasing people, everyday people, who do their best so that with their little deeds they would help out the armed forces of Russia in Ukraine. And obviously, they are exclusively portrayed as enthusiastic supporters. And altogether, the main message of this program is that Russia, as one person, strongly, firmly stands behind Putin and is convinced that the war should go on until it should. The Hungarian government, however, does something similar and somewhat different in a different sense. It is called the national consultation. National consultation eventually is a direct marketing campaign, which entails that the government sends out to every single household in Hungary a questionnaire, a highly propagandistic questionnaire, consisting usually of about 8 or 9 questions. These questions are really biased and truly propagandistic. It's not obligatory to answer the questions and send it back, but still some people, especially enthusiastic Fidesz supporters, do that. Needless to say, when the results get back, the results are not published and not verified. Therefore, the communicated results can be whatever, and it is whatever, because according to the calculations of investigative journalists, about 17% of Hungarian people decided, for instance, that no, they do not want sanctions, so that they said no to the sanctions. However, what was communicated after the national consultation by the government, as you can see also here on the billboard, that 97% of Hungarians said no to the sanctions. Therefore, we can also see here that this illusion of national consensus over the policies and over the support of the government is forged. This is how it's being forged. This is how it's there. Another shared practice is that autocratic leaders may not allow to appear anyone who could be challenging them. Therefore, they should maintain the illusion that there is no alternative to them. There are many ways to do that. For instance, probably it is not a coincidence that neither in Russia, neither in Hungary has been recently, in the recent decades, any debate before elections where also the leader himself would have been there. Probably this is also not a coincidence. And also another shared practice is that for the regime, it's better and best to discourage people from partaking in public life if they do not agree with the government. Therefore, smear campaigns against those who would be and would be willing to are rather prevalent and quite often occurring. A couple of words about how do the two regimes portray each other, because it's pretty interesting and it's far from equal, interestingly enough. So if we look at how is Russia portrayed in Hungary, we can see that Russia is the established star of the Hungarian pro-government propaganda apparatus since about 2010. This is a constant, basically a quite constant narration. Russia is being praised, Russia is being treated as a superpower, and there are many other very positive features which are constantly given to Russia according to the government's rhetorics. What we can see, for instance, since Russia Today was banned in the EU altogether, what we have seen is that direct references from where the Hungarian propaganda is referring to RT, these have almost entirely disappeared. However, the amount of content which they have taken from Russian outlets did not really change, which just means that they have cut out this extra step of referring to RT, and they started to refer to content which RT has originally referred to. So what we can see is that even though this ban had certain impact, about the volume, it did not change much. What we can see on the other side, that originally and traditionally, Hungary did not really have a prevalent place in Russian propaganda, domestic propaganda meaning. So Hungary is clearly a rising star in the Russian domestic propaganda. We can see that especially since the invasion started, Hungary's reputation has steadily been growing. Plus also there was a very interesting shift. Earlier on, the Russian propaganda, when talking about Hungary and referring whatever is happening in Hungary, most of the time they were referring to the Hungarian news agency, and then they were using that material and writing their own propagandistic news about that. Now, increasingly, they refer directly to governmental propaganda, so Origo, Demokrata, Magyar Nemzet, and so. And also what we can see is that it is a quite unequal relationship. If Russia's interest dictates so, they can openly dispose and display, they can openly display that Hungary is just a junior partner. So if Russia's interest dictates so, they are not afraid of humiliating even Hungarian ministers, which reciprocally could never happen. And what is very interesting is that there are many mutually picked up narratives. What is obviously there and very easy to use, that the enemy pictures are very much are strongly overlapping. Of course, the enemy pictures are usually the US, Brussels, Ukraine. So these propaganda apparatuses feast on the contents related to that. However, we can also see something rather new. That, for instance, here you can see on the picture, there was this Hungarian absolutely fabricated report provided by Hungarian propaganda's fringe outlet, Pesti Srácok. They went to Transcarpathia and they basically have carried out, they made a very interesting and absolutely fictitious little report, which had represented Ukrainians as if they were conscripting Hungarians exclusively based on their ethnic basis, and they have portrayed it as somewhat of kidnapping and so on. So the whole thing was absolutely staged and fictitious. However, Russian propaganda loved it, so the story was absolutely picked up by TASS and distributed all across Russia. So what we can see is that even Hungarian disinformation can go to Russia now, and so was the newly invented expression, kényszersorozás. It's highly deceptive because eventually conscription, it can be best translated as forceful conscription. However, conscription already has this element of using force in it. I mean, that is not happening voluntarily. Yet adding kényszer, adding forceful to it, has clearly altered the meaning of it, and is used by the Hungarian governmental propaganda ever since heavily. So the conclusions, what we can see is that there clearly is a cross-border learning. However, this seems to be rather one-sided. Even though there are numerous similarities, obviously there are still a lot of differences as well. What makes this cooperation so easy is the shared dynamic pictures. However, what we have seen is it's oftentimes one-sided. So Russia is not afraid to display supremacy should the Kremlin's needs dictate so. What we can see is that also the volume of narrative picked up from each other is unequal. Hungary does it obviously a lot more often so in its domestic propaganda. The two apparatuses increasingly grow together. But we can see with regards to the volume of the overall used material. And one more thing, the Hungarian governmental propaganda does not use every single, not even every popular Russian material, for instance, which pictures Ukrainians in the light they please to see it in. So it's very interesting because apparently there is certain selectivity. The Hungarian apparatus does not use every single material. They do the selection somehow, or they receive it selected by someone. This is also very interesting, and most likely it would require some deeper insights in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dorota, and thank you for this highly interesting, but on the other hand also somehow shocking presentation of the overlap and actually the almost identical extent of the toolkit of the Hungarian regime and the Russian one. I gathered a couple of follow-up questions, but being mindful of the time, I will ask them on the Q&A part. And instead of that, on the one hand, I would like to encourage you, ladies and gentlemen, all to submit your questions. On the other hand, I would like to give the floor to Anton, who is actually, I think, one of the most seasoned, both academic researcher, but also policy analyst when it comes to Russian foreign information manipulation and interference in the European Union. So I would like to ask you primarily, what were the most interesting takeaways from your perspective that resonate the most with your experience? And what would be potentially those parts of the findings and papers where you would like to just raise some questions? Anton, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you to all three of you for these great presentations. The feeling that I had after hearing those presentations is that I want more. I want more research of the same high quality. So congratulations on your findings, on your results. With Franziska and Balint, I think one of the most interesting parts is it's probably not so much about the narratives, because this is known. What these people are saying, what those parties are promoting, I think it's he identified it already in the very beginning. What's interesting is how those narratives, or topoi, I prefer to use the term narrative. Apparently, this is what you call topoi, is that they differ depending on the method or the means of distribution of those topoi. You mentioned, something is for press releases, at least for the Austrian far right part, some for the blogosphere, and this is very interesting because they address or they talk to different audiences, and when you or other people, you or other people, think or start considering what can be done in order to somehow, not necessarily stop those ideas and narrative from distributing, but somehow address the trouble. This is very important because then you see what audiences are considered by those actors as the vulnerable to particular messages. This is really interesting, and this is very important for all the practical decisions as to how you can mitigate the problem. With the presentation of Dorka, I really like the part of when you say that this unequal relationship. This is again very important for the reasons that I will also talk about. And what's also important, and that you brilliantly identified, is that how Moscow actually sees those relations, or the actors, feeders, from the position of supremacy, and how Hungarians, or Hungary as a country, may be denigrated by the Kremlin propaganda. Again, this is very important because now I really want to talk. Well, first, maybe some suggestions as to how further research can be done. I had a student at the CEU with the International Relations Department, and he last semester. So he wrote a master thesis, which I found quite insightful. So what he did, he introduced what he himself called a natural language processing based detection method for finding the roots of particular topoi or narratives or messages. Why this is important? In one of my books, which was dealing specifically with the relations between Russia and the far right and the West, I introduced the term narrative laundering. It's the sort of a process of movement of information or narratives in the media space, with a very clear aim to lose the source of information of a narrative. Yeah. So when a narrative loses its source, where it came up from, then a narrative is laundered. The same with the criminal money. So what this student of mine, what he did, he tried, and he used actually the Hungarian media as his base, or and he tried to track and to trace particular narratives found in the Hungarian pro-Fidesz or media, and to trace them back to the Russian sources. And he had a very nice percentage of clarity in what he was doing. So I think that, and now I'm sure now it is possible with the use of AI, actually see where particular ideas and messages came from. And this could also be used in order to, to show, for journalistic investigations, to show that politicians, or some illiberal politicians, and also the affiliated media, illiberal media, how they parroting the narratives coming from other Russian sources, or Chinese for that matter. At least for the Hungarian case, we know how the Chinese propaganda is also very important. So to show this, very, very clear that they're just parroting, that they they don't think for themselves. They just not just taking and introducing foreign propaganda into the European media space. So this is one thing. This is about detecting and identifying the sources of particular messages. Then talking about what can be done, both presentations feature those recommendations, and I cannot stress enough the importance of journalistic investigations. This is something that is absolutely crucial, and I remember this phrase that Steve Bannon, whom you all know, I'm sure, he said once, and pardon my language, but this is a direct quotation from Steve Bannon. He was giving an interview, and he said, well, the Democratic Party is not a problem. The media is the real problem. Flood the zone with shit. And what he meant is a tactic that, well, you don't really introduce any smart narratives or smart ideas. You just flood the zone. You just overcrowd the media space with your narratives. And this is what Dorka mentioned this. I don't remember. Maybe someone else. That the press releases of the Fidesz party, was it you, Dorka, or was it Valent? Okay, Valent. They look all the same. There was an investigation a couple of years ago or last year, I don't remember exactly. There was an investigation into the tactics of the Russian state-controlled media. They don't come up every day with some new ideas. No, just they repeat the same lies every day, several times a day, and this works because and it's exactly flooding the zone with not necessarily with some bullshit, but just repetition. They flood the zone. Yeah, and then at some point people consider this, well, if it's repeated so many times, it must be true, or at least something is true. This is a psychological trick. This has nothing to do with narratives being smart or ideas being smart. No, it's just the quantity, the sheer quantity. It's in one of the pieces I call this, the meat waves of Russian information war. As you know, the Wagner Group used to use meat waves, so using people as cannon fodder, just overwhelm the Ukrainian forces by sheer numbers, not necessarily by weapons, but by sheer numbers of human bodies. So they do the same with these messages. So again, investigations, yeah. Then I missed it reading your papers, but they don't really mention that, maybe I'm wrong again, the importance of looking at the workings of social media. I'm sure you're all familiar now with the quite a scandalous case in Romania. Yeah, a candidate, okay, let's call him far right, whatever. It doesn't really matter, but a fringe candidate whom nobody knew somehow tricked the algorithms on TikTok, yeah, and he finished first in the elections. Social media algorithms have become a very important tactic, or a field where so much work needs to be done by the governments, by the European Union. It cannot continue as it continues now. It just otherwise our media space will be turned into a swamp, yeah, and no information would be trusted. Algorithms should be dealt with. But then also, what I already mentioned, and I'm finishing. I know that people have questions to the presenters. What is very important is when I said that it is important to identify the sources of particular messages, or liberal messages. Some of those sources are coming from Russia, they're coming from China, and it is very important to take from those people, like the FPÖ, like Fidesz, the term patriotism. It should be taken away from them. And patriotism should be a good word, because these people, they're not patriots. they are doing the bidding of foreign powers. And they call themselves European patriots. They are not. And I'm sure that this has to be stressed by politicians and also by media. This is really important, because in many cases patriotism, for some bizarre reason, is being denigrated, as almost as ultranationalism or similar terminology. These people are not patriots. What they call their group, the Patriots of Europe, this is all fake. They are serving interests of foreign non-European powers. And another thing which is very important, and then I'll stop, it is really, really important when dealing with those with ideas, topoi, and messages of illiberal actors, is to identify divisions among them in order to show them those divisions, and use the divide and rule. It's a very good old practice of how you deal with your opponents. And it's not only about identifying divisions, but also identifying where they actually fail with their tactics. Because if we know how they fail, this may be somehow reproduced, and not only, probably not only about them, but about other similar illiberal actors in Europe. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anton, for your valuable reflections. And ladies and gentlemen, the Q&A is open, so please submit your questions. And I would just suggest to make a first round, potentially with the first couple of questions we already received. There is one actually to the whole panel from Professor Zsolt Enyedi, a sort of counterfactual question. What do you think, how would European political discourse look like without any sort of Russian interference and presence in the European information ecosystems? A question from George Krobak to Franziska and Balint. To what extent, if any, did you encounter Russian critical discourse from FPÖ or Fidesz, for example, immediately after the massacre of Bucha? How frequently were these actors, so Fidesz and FPÖ, either reserved or critical in their use of Russia as a legitimation strategy, and if they were reserved, then in what context? And last but not least, my question to both Dorka and Anton. For someone like me who is rather working from a European and Western perspective on the autocratizing illiberals of Central and Eastern Europe, and not so often on Russia, it's also very interesting to see the Hungarian regime and Prime Minister Orbán as a sort of underdog who is on the receiving end of the transnational knowledge transfer of illiberalism and autocratization, because in a purely Western context, he's very often actually presented as the intellectual mastermind who developed actually the illiberal and authoritarian blueprint for Western democracies. And he's treated that way both in a transatlantic context, as we know, and in a European one. And I am not stating that these two perceptions are mutually exclusive. I think these two perceptions are valid and true in the same time, but it's still a very intriguing situation. And against that background, I just would like to ask you, based on your current and former research, what do you see, what are the variables that determine actually the direction and the characteristics of authoritarian learning? So how does authoritarian learning happens from your perspective between Russia and its pawns, and whether we can actually consider either Prime Minister Orbán or other actors actually as intermediaries in this learning process between the Kremlin and the two targets, which most likely are in Western Europe and in the United States. And I would just suggest to go in the same order like we went with the presentations. So I would like to give the floor to Franziska and Balint.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting two presentations. Thank you, Dorka and Anton. Maybe just very, very shortly, some responses to Anton. I absolutely agree. Social media has become a very disturbing and very important to research topic. And I think this also links with your first point of different audiences. And I think social media is a whole different situation, and also the different kinds of social media. So I fully agree with you on that. And one last point to what you have mentioned regarding the what you call flood the zone. There is a PhD student at the University of Vienna who does, Italina Kulichkina, who does great work on China and the whole system of repression by China, and she addresses exactly that. And I think we have a similar case here with what you mentioned, is that state repression very much can be working through social media by just sending messages at extreme amounts through social media, which then pushes down maybe potential dissent. And in the Chinese case, she shows it that this is exactly what has happened with the COVID-19 demonstrations in 2021, 2022, where she very much shows that exactly this flooding the zone. And I think we can have a similar situation here as well, and also in the US. Regarding the two questions, well, firstly, the counterfactual by Professor Schroeder-Niedi. I think it's very hard to say because I think currently, and especially doing research on this topic, it kind of permeates everything. But actually, I don't think it would look that much differently. It would not necessarily be about Russia, obviously, but I think parties would look for a new authoritarian actor. And I think we have a nice example of that with FPÖ, the Austrian Freedom Party under Haider. So before FPÖ turned towards Russia, they were a big fan of Saddam Hussein. And Haider even visited him and then came back and wrote a book about his experience, about how cultivated he is and how interesting he is, and an expert in so many issues, and very educated and very open for different opinions. So I think it would not necessarily look that much different. You might have a different actor, but I think, and this also has been mentioned by Dorker in her amazing work, is that actors pick messages. So it's not necessarily an unconscious influence and spreading of ideology or information, but it's a very conscious selection of information and of narratives that the different actors decide to choose. And with that, maybe it would still be Russia, maybe it would be just another narrative of a neighboring country, but I think actors would still pick these messages and would still try to frame them and use them to legitimize themselves and to find someone else they're closer with. And I think we can also maybe see that with Orbán, how he's going towards China as well, instead of opposing himself to the EU. So I think there will always be some actor that might look a bit more interesting to them. And lastly, regarding the second question on the Russia critical discourse from FPÖ Fidesz, I can mainly talk from the Austrian and maybe also the German perspective. And what we can see here is that you don't have a lot of critical stances. What you have is balancing. So meaning that you say, okay, we need to have negotiations from both sides. We need to not only take into account, I don't know, a meeting with Zelensky, but also with Putin. And this is also what happened post-Bucha. So in the Austrian, there was a committee in the Austrian parliament to address these issues, and especially the crimes against humanity in general, not necessarily only on Russia. And there they talked about Bucha, and FPÖ very much stated that we need more balanced thinking about the situation, and we need to take more into account to take a step towards Putin as well. While at the same time, they proposed in the same committee session a bill to have more transparency for organizations financing foreign organizations, such as different sub-organizations of the UN. So it's on the one side demanding a balanced approach, but at the other side also distracting with different topics. Thank you very much for those questions.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for these great comments from Anton, and also some excellent questions from the audience. So I would like to just react to the counterfactual that Professor Enyedi raised, and I agree with Franziska in that it doesn't need to be Russia. So Russia could be replaced by another strong authoritarian actor that could be used as a point of reference. Nevertheless, I think in the current context, Russia serves these regimes as a very powerful source of legitimation, and it's mostly due to its sheer strength, which I think also gives courage to these actors to use a more aggressive, more discriminatory language when they discuss issues like LGBTQ issues. So I'm not saying Fidesz would not be anti-LGBTQ if it was not for Russia, but maybe they wouldn't talk about Western lunacy and things like that. You know, you can only talk about Western lunacy when there's another non-Western actor that legitimizes this kind of speech. And I think this also refers to the courage with which they use some of the tactics Anton was describing. So this flooding of the media. So, you know, like if you're someone who's trained in a liberal democratic media system, it may seem stupid or intellectually questionable to send out the same press release 150 times without any alteration. The whole thing consists of 100 words. It just looks really, I don't know, mind dumbing. So but if you see that there's another very influential international actor who's doing this and it works, then you may be more open to adapting this strategy. So I think in that sense, Russia is an important precedent that is not important in its Russianness, but it's important in its powerful authoritarian nature. And then regarding the other question on whether there has been any criticism on Russia expressed by Fidesz, yes, but so there's this similar balancing act as Franziska described, and then there's a distinction in that they only criticize Russia in reactive communication. So whatever Fidesz publishes, their press releases, their speeches, their interviews, they never proactively start criticizing Russia in the war. Sometimes it happens in press conferences or other situations that they are really pressed to say something about this. Like the same journalist asked the question, I don't know, 5 times, that is Russia an aggressor or not? And then eventually a minister or spokesperson, yes, that, okay, if you insist so much, yes, Russia is an aggressor as it is in international law. But they do not proactively make such statements, nor do they issue condemnations of whatever Russia does. So it's a very careful act of balancing and neutrality. Thank you.
Thank you, Balint. Dorka?
Okay, so first of all, I would like to answer to your question, Daniel. The thing is that according to the literature that I have, I gathered because I really wanted to explore what this learning process between illiberal and autocratizing regimes means. And apparently, there are many factors which clearly have an importance here, and which can lead to absolutely different outcomes. So, for instance, whether the political systems are similar, whether there are other structural constraints, but what is clearly visible that, for instance, there are certain topics where this illiberal learning is ongoing, and that, for instance, entails media control. Media control is essential. However, this autocratic transition is not always intentional. So these autocratizing regimes may look at each other and borrow good practices, But even according to their internal logics, they may come to very different outcomes, at least according to what I have found. But for instance, with regards to what is happening between Russia and Hungary, here I have clearly seen that here Hungary is the underdog. For instance, I have enlisted here that when the Hungarian parliament passed the bill, we all remember the Lex CEU, we don't always tend to remember what happened right before. Well, 2 weeks before, the exact same thing happened in Russia, because there is also the European University in St. Petersburg, and only 2 weeks before the Hungarian decision was taken, a rather arbitrarily court decision in Russia was taken, which basically has stripped off the license this university. And the narratives were eerily similar, that this place is way too liberal, that is promoting gender ideology, and so on. And we all know this. So there are certain things and certain little signs which just prove that most likely this was not entirely coincidental. But for instance, there are other cases where we can clearly see that the Hungarian regime was copying the Russian one, which are, for instance, the laws against gay propaganda. There is also palpable, absolutely palpable, and also the instrumentalization of sovereignty protection. We all remember that Russia was the first to introduce the laws against foreign agents, then later on, obviously expanding the scope to sky high growth. But the thing is that, of course, we can see that the Hungarian regime in certain places such as this is actually copy-pasting, but of course there are certain external limitations which on the Hungarian regime still work. On the Russian one, apparently not. And if I may address, I have seen one question from the audience, and I would love to respond to that, which entails Szijjártó's visit today in Moscow. I would just like to respond to it briefly because it perfectly summarizes everything which I told about how the Russian governmental apparatus and propaganda uses the Hungarian presence. So what is visible is that the Russian propaganda apparatus uses today's Szijjártó visit, for instance, to showcase that, well, the EU is fragmented, the EU is absolutely not united, because here is one EU representative or representative of an EU member country, yet there are some others who, meanwhile he's here, are criticizing us. So, well, look at the EU. The EU itself is not even knowing what it's doing. So on the one hand, we can clearly see this, that it showcases a very bad and fragmented picture of the EU. On the other hand, it also showcases, meaning at the press conference afterwards, when Szijjártó and Lavrov are standing next to each other, and Lavrov is talking. And what he is doing, that for 10 minutes, he's constantly bashing the NATO and EU. Meanwhile, an EU and NATO member country's Minister of Foreign Affairs is standing next to him in a visibly awkward stance. So that is the crystal clear representation of showcasing how the Russian partner is asserting dominance and how they are picturing it as well to their domestic audiences. Thank you. Passing back.
Thank you so much, Dorka. And potentially we can also add that Foreign Minister Szijjártó is actually providing that opportunity for the Russian propaganda on a bi-monthly, quarterly basis, undergoing under the same treatment, which makes that contribution, actually Hungarian contribution to Russian propaganda, particularly valuable. Anton, I would like to give you the floor, both to respond to the questions and potentially as discussants also to summarize your thoughts in closing words, being mindful of the time that we are slowly approaching the end of the webinar. Over to you.
Daniel, regarding your question and what you said, Orbán definitely for many in the West, across the West, is a blueprint. And there are two reasons, I think, why he has become a sort of a figure of importance for the Western far right. Well, first, he actually delivers speeches which are deeply ideological. And this is something that is lacking on the level of official leaders of the far right across the West. So partly one of the reasons why, so to say, one of the reasons why he has become so popular is because the competition is not very intellectual competition among far right politicians to Orbán is not that strong. Yeah, so it is the lack of competition that made him sort of a figure, ideological figure of the far right. The other reason is that, of course, he's the leader. He is the leader of a country. So his position by itself, official position of prime minister, this is something. This, you know, this means that this person has been successful, yeah, and partly because of the ideology that he brought with himself. This is why he is popular, yeah. So the low competition in the sort of intellectual far right, and his position. And as for learning, you know, these people, they are actually not very different from us. They live in their illiberal bubble, information bubble. They meet at conferences and they learn the best practices, like we do. There is you know, not much difference. And they, of course, they look what works and what doesn't work. For Orbán specifically and other people in the region, look at Fico, right? Fico is learning from Orbán. Orbán is learning some practices. There's this, you know, mutual learning. Yeah, they learn what works, especially when it comes to how you deal with Brussels, how you know, how you can cheat on Brussels with different other forces. So this is, yep, just, you know, observing, they're observing and see what works or what doesn't. And but what Dorka said about Sijarto and Lavrov, you remember Lavrov did the same with Borrell a couple of years back. But after that, Borrell actually became quite, you know, hardcore in a way. So this is how the Russians behave. This is their typical behavior, this intimidation, bashing, use of quite a vulgar language, in fact, in order to intimidate their opponents. And this should be used against them, as I said, to show that these people, actually, the illiberals they don't have problems with Brussels. I think this, you know, we should reframe the entire discourse. It's not the Brussels that is their main, you know, target. We should say they are against Europe. They are not European patriots. They are, you know, this is not about Brussels. Their main opponent is the spirit of Europe. However you want to define this spirit, but this is crucial. And yes, there will be sort of some concluding remarks. There will be learning. This is not going anywhere. They will learn how to deal with the media. One of the scandals that were connected to the Ibiza affair a few years back, how the FPÖ, two leaders of the FPÖ, they were secretly filmed on the island of Ibiza. And one of the scandals was that Strache, then the leader of the FPÖ, was saying, we want to have control over the media like Orbán does, like what Orbán has in Hungary. And this is, yeah, he confirms we are learning. We want exactly like that. Whether we can actually have this control, this is another matter. But yeah, for the media control, I totally agree with the presenters. It is something that these illiberals they want. Yeah, as Steve Bannon said, it's not the Democratic Party which is the problem; it's the media. So the media should be protected. The freedom of the media should be protected at all costs. And we need to invest more into investigations and support of small regional media. This is crucial. This is existential for the free media space in Europe.
Thank you so much, Anton. Just very brief reaction. I think we can only hope that liberal democratic transnational learning will one day as intense and as successful in the future than illiberal and authoritarian is. And it is certainly the ambition of AUTHLIB to contribute to that. Dorka, Franziska, Balint, Anton, thank you so much for your valuable insights today and for this very, very engaging conversation. Dear attendees, thank you for being with us today. If you are interested in the illiberalism and liberal democracy related work of AUTHLIB, Please visit our website, follow us in social media, and subscribe to our newsletter. And I hope that we can welcome you in our future events. Have a wonderful day and goodbye.
Thank
See
you.
you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.